Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well during this challenging time. I'm Debbie Brody, and I'd like to welcome you to the second in our series of virtual lectures from Israel. At Federation, we've been focused on making sure our greater Metro West community members stay safe and feel supported during these uncertain times. This includes our Federation Board approving up to $1 million to address COVID-19 emergency needs locally, in Israel, and around the world. Recently, we allocated $50,000 to our global partners, JDC and Jaffe, for emergency food supplies for elderly Jews, especially Shoah, Holocaust survivors in Israel, and the former Soviet Union. We also sent an additional $20,000 to our partner cities in Israel, Ofakim and Rishon LeZion, for Passover food packages. At the same time, we also want to ensure that we don't let other important things pass us by, including celebrating Israel, especially since Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, is next week. Those of you who attended the community mission in Israel in 2018 know how outstanding our speakers are. Today's speaker is Eli Parnassa, Bus 8 tour guide, whose topic is From Zero to 100, the Land of Israel from 1897 to 1997. Eli is a skillful and highly experienced tour guide who has earned experience in the field of Jewish informal education. He holds an LLB degree in law and is a graduate of the High Institute of Torah, both from Bar Ilan University. Eli is fluent in English and Italian and is eager to pass on the enthusiasm about Israel to as many tourists as possible. Eli will speak for about 35 minutes. He will answer questions twice, one in the middle of his talk and at the end. If at any time you have a question for Eli, please click on the chat feature on your screen and we will collect the questions to ask Eli. Or you can use the raise your hand feature so we can call on you to ask a question. We will get to as many questions as we can before we close the program by 1 p.m. We have muted everyone. Please leave it muted for the duration of the call so we can hear our speakers well. Enjoy the presentation and welcome, Eli. It is so great to have you here with us today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this great opportunity. I'm really looking forward for this very special time, special occasion. Of course, all over the world, as we all know, we're facing a very unusual situation. From our behalf here in Israel, it's not that different than it is in the States. I mean, we're all pretty much stay at home unless your work is needed, which means, unfortunately, from my perspective as a tour guide, that there is no tourism whatsoever in Israel as in most parts of the world. It creates a lot of challenges, especially from my personal perspective, just because I'm a father of 3. My oldest is 5, so it's a very tight bunch. But in any event, I do look forward for better time, just because that I'm sure you're updated in the news. Israel, relatively speaking to other places in the world, is doing okay, if you can define it in this manner, in terms of fighting the coronavirus on the one hand. On the other hand, that's definitely in the economical situation, the future is very unclear. It's not surprising that as long as this crisis goes on, the economical crisis continues and increases. Even though I have to say, especially walking out from Passover time. There are less restrictions. Stores at open streets are open. So it seems like it's getting slightly a bit more to normal on the one hand. On the other hand, the Ministry of Health is taking it in a very, very cautious level. In other words, there's no schooling whatsoever. So kids stay at home, which means I stay at home. And we're looking forward for better days, which I'm sure they're yet to come. In any event, the reason I called my lecture Israel, the land of Israel from 0 to 100, is just to emphasize the giant leaps, literally, that this land took in the past century and more. Of course, as most of you have been in Israel in the near past or even before, you've seen it with your own eyes how Israel has advanced in such a terrific, almost miraculous way. So what I want to show you today really is to understand the foundation of it, to understand how Israel become the great country it is today. Of course, I'm not talking about the last month and a half, which is extremely challenging. But for those of you who have been in Israel in recent years, you've seen for yourself how Israel in any aspect is doing amazing. There's no other way to describe it. We surpassed the GDP per capita of France, of Britain, of other great powers in the world. So again, if I'm taking a step back to the coronavirus situation, we're doing better than other countries, at least from this aspect. The way I want to start it, if I'm talking from 1897, is actually to start with a little twist with you guys. So I'm going to switch to the next slide, which is going to show you one of the most famous authors of America, which is, of course, Mark Twain. Well, before he was this old guy you see over here, Mark Twain, he was the young journalist called Samuel Clement. And he came to the land of Israel, believe it or not, in 1867. 1867 was the year, and he wrote a famous journal, which I highly recommend if you can get your hands on this book. It's one of these books, at least from me as a tour guide, I read over and over and over again. And it's amazing to see from a young journalist from America to see how the land of Israel used to look like not too long ago. So if I'm just going to switch to the next slide, you're going to see exactly how it looks like. My friends, what you see right now is a picture of Damascus Gate of the old city of Jerusalem. The year is 1860. Guys, it's only 150 years ago. Look, there's sand dunes outside. I mean, you can only imagine how it looks like today. I'm just going to switch to the next one. Modern time, 100 years later, there's no comparison. And this is exactly, if I'm going to switch back just one more time, guys, this is how Israel looks like back then. And who are the people who are ruling Israel back then over a century ago? We're talking about the Ottoman Empire. And in the last century of this empire, the 19th century, is doing pretty bad. And when I say bad, it means that there was a saying that if the Sultan has a sneezing problem in Istanbul, so over here in the Middle East, you have the flu. And the situation is really, really bad. And the journal that Mark Twain himself wrote describes exactly that. So the question is how this desert became this flourishing land. It's got to do, of course, with the establishment of the Zionist movement. And we really have to hand it to one very important figure. And this person, if I'm going to switch here, again, you can see the Ottoman Empire, how it looks like at the last stage. And during the end of the 19th century, that is when comes up to the stage this man, which I'm sure a lot of us know just by looking at the picture. This is the founding father of the modern state of Israel. Now, I say modern state, there wasn't a Jewish state in ancient time. There was a Jewish kingdom. There were Jewish tribes of Israel, something which is very, very different from our time. Now, this young man, as you can tell by the picture, Theodore Herzl, was born in Western Europe. And remember, Europe in the end of the 19th century is the dominant powers are situated. America is not there yet. It's going to be, of course, after World War I. We're talking about the British Empire. We're talking about the French Empire. We're talking about the Germans. Herzl himself was born actually in Budapest as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was raised in Vienna. Guys, Vienna is where everything is happening in the end of the 19th century. Now you ask yourself, what is this young man, which looks like a typical aristocrat European person in Europe, how is he linking himself to establishment of the Jewish state? Well, if you're going to look at the history books, and right now we see a picture of the first Congress back in 1897, all the events linked it to one very traumatic scene that happened in France just a couple years before this Congress, as you can see in the picture, which took place in Basel in Switzerland. What happened is that there was a French officer. His name was Alfred Dreyfus, and Alfred Dreyfus was tried with treason. Of course, make no mistake, he was extremely loyal, but unfortunately, he was held as betrayed. And young Theodore Herzl, I'm just going to switch back to the slide of Herzl. Theodore Herzl was a young journalist in Paris, and he was a reporter for a newspaper in Vienna. He saw the events. It was just a pure anti-Semitic occasion of what happened to poor Alfred Dreyfus, we have to say, in Paris, 1895. And what historians, a lot people say, is that because of these events, young Theodore Herzl came up with the well-known idea of establishing a Jewish state in the historical homeland of Israel, which you just saw in the previous slide how it looks like. You can't compare it to any place in Europe at that time. But I want to challenge ourselves. See, I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions. Was Theodore Herzl the only Jewish journalist in Paris reporting about Alpha trial? Of course not. There are many of them. Even more than that, is Theodore Herzl is the only Jew in Europe at that time which faces, unfortunately, a lot of anti-Semitism? Of course not. So what makes Herzl Herzl? I'm going to slide forward to here. You can see over here Alfred Dreyfus with this very traumatic event. What a humiliation. You can see the French officer just ripping his ranks and tearing down his sword. Very, very sad. But again, the challenge is what makes Herzl Herzl? Even more than that, I switched to an image which I bet most of us don't even know his name. This guy, his name was Finsker. He came up with the same idea as Herzl. Years before that, he came up with his own establishment of a Zionist Congress. Even more than that, he wrote a book exactly as Theodore Herzl did years after. So, if Finsker was before Herzl, if Finsker had a Congress before him, what makes Herzl Herzl? Well, if I'm going to switch to the next slide, we're going to understand it much, much better. Theodore Herzl wrote a book, yes, like the guy we saw before, Finsker. But what makes Herzl Herzl is the fact that when he addressed the crowd in the first Congress back in 1897, he made statements that just made people believe in him. The irony is, of course, that Herzl, being a person that was raised in Austro-Hungarian Empire, spoke fluent in German. And you can see the original copy of the booklet that he wrote after Alfred Dreyfus trial. And it's, of course, in German, Judenstaat. This is, of course, the Jewish state. And it's like a manual script about how exactly is a Jewish, how does a Jewish state works like. And when Theodore Herzl addressed the crowd in the first Congress in 1897, and he said, "We are people, we are one people," people believed him. And that is something that was different, and Finsker didn't have it, and Herzl did. And even more than that, Theodore Herzl, unfortunately, some people prescribe him as one type of a person or another one, but the fact is that Theodore Herzl didn't really belong to any political party. There wasn't any political party. Everybody related to him. He spoke about the land of Israel as the land of our forefathers, and he said it even in the Hebrew ancient term, which made everybody from Orthodox to Reform, from communist Jews to capitalist Jews, to relate to the idea of this modern exodus of Egypt. And when I say modern exodus of Egypt, I mean that Theodore Herzl himself wrote it in the book. He didn't see himself as something that is making up something new. No, he's just renewing ancient times. In other words, Theodore Herzl was deeply connected, deeply related to his heritage, to his tradition, but at the same time, he wanted to move onward to the future and have a Jewish state for the Jewish people. What's even greater about Herzl is the fact that if you move onwards, you can see in the background a picture of the Second World Congress, and you can see actually a picture of the flag. My friends, already back in 1898, there was literally a flag as we know it today. Next week, we're going to celebrate Independence Day here in Israel, and this is exactly what was decided years before even the State of Israel was established. Everybody was on it. I'll give you another example. There was a decision of establishing not only the World Zionist Organization, but you can see the famous blue box that everybody contributed, even today, to the JNF. The JNF was decided to be established by Herzl in the World Zionist Congress. The Jewish agencies, first of all, were established by Theodore Herzl himself. In other words, the layout, the foundation of the future Jewish state was established years before. I just want to wrap it up with one last thing about Herzl. In his journal, he wrote after the first Congress that in Basel, he established a Jewish state. That is something, a statement that most people know. What people don't know is the continuation of this sentence. What Herzl did, he wrote in his journal, in Basel, I established a Jewish state. If it's not going to be a reality today, it's definitely going to be a reality in 50 years. And guess what? If you fast forward 50 years, 1897, 1947, and we're going to, of course, touch a little bit about the famous Partition Plan, his dream became a reality. He was a big dreamer, but he also literally made it happen. We're kind of moving more or less to halftime. So if you people have any question for me, that is definitely time to ask some question before I move forward. Yeah, here. So I see a question coming up. Let me know if you have anything to ask. If not, I'm just gonna move on. I see that Ron Brandit raised a hand. I can take your question.
Yes. Did
Yes,
Herzl support the Uganda proposal?
Great question. Ron, thank you so much for bringing this point up. The amazing thing about it, well, he was amazing in every aspect, as you can tell by me speaking about him. Theodore Herzl was a remarkable politician. You need to do politics. What are you going to do in the world scale? When the Brits, my friends, the British Empire turned to Herzl as the representative of the Jewish people, this is unheard of. For us today, it's obvious. Of course, there's Jewish people, Jewish state. Who thought about it over 100 years ago? The British Empire turned to Theodore Herzl and told him, well, we can't give you your historical homeland. The British have their own interests. How about Uganda? Make no mistake. Herzl had no doubt that the state of the Jews is going to be in the historical homeland. But he can't tell the British, sorry, it's not good enough. He needs to be respectful for them and debate this author. And of course, in the famous Congress in Uganda, everybody was against them. Herzl himself was against that. And he told the British very politely, of course, thank you so much for the proposal. But as you can see, my people are against that. That was an amazing advancement because people recognize the Jewish people and that they're entitled of their own state. So thank you for this question. If there aren't any more questions, I'm just going to move on.
Eli, we have another question from Peter.
Please, Peter.
Hi. Thank you very much for what you're doing.
Thank you.
When you discussed the span of the Jewish people in the Congress, you had you mentioned from Reform all the way through to Orthodox, and I wonder the cultural span was probably equally as great from people living in shtetls in Eastern Europe to the very cultured Germans and other communities. Were they all truly involved? There must have been, I mean, there must have been a real, gap about visions and capabilities. What can you comment on that?
Okay, so Peter, great question. So the thing is this: everybody that shared the same idea of establishment of a Jewish state took part, participated literally in the Congress. I mean, it's another topic, but there were Orthodox Jews, rabbis who were members of the World Zionist Organization right from the beginning. At the same time, of course, you can imagine there were a lot of Orthodox Jews who weren't, who were out of this game, so to speak, just because they didn't see it as something that is the time for it, especially because that Herzl was conceived as a very modern, very secular Jew. On the one hand, on the other hand, there were people that saw him as a very conservative Jew. What makes Herzl so great is the fact that people attacked him from so many directions. So as we say, he probably did something right. Okay, I'm gonna move on with my session. So we saw the blue box. I'm just gonna fast forward some great people. As Peter, you jumped into an open door. You barged in. You see Echad Ha'am. He was actually an author, and even though he was so different than Herzl, he took part of the World Zionist Organization. And the next one is Max Nordau. This guy, actually, believe it or not, he was the founding father of the idea of the Jewish Olympics, of the Maccabiah. This is Max Nordau. Another one, David Wolfson. This is actually the guy, believe it or not, who proposed what's going to be the future Jewish flag state already in 1902, I believe so. So these are all great people, very different from one another, and also very different from Herzl. Wolfson actually took place to Herzl. Herzl died, I'm just going to tie the knot. Herzl died 1904. He was 44 years of age, but this young guy changed the Jewish destiny forever. So that's what's happening in Europe. Let's see what's happening in Israel. My friends, I'm zooming into a map of Israel back in the 1900s. In other words, at the same time, European Jews are having this dream of establishing a modern Jewish state in Israel, just like Europe. At the same time, there are already Jews in Israel doing the same thing. So even though officially they're not part of the World Zionist Organization, they're doing exactly what the World Zionist Organization is designed for, establishing a Jewish state. And what more than that in establishing Jewish settlements? I'm talking about Petach Tikva and Mikveh Israel and Nes Ziona and Rehovot. Today, these are all big cities in Israel. The guy you see over here, example of a frum Jew, his name is Solomon. He established Petach Tikva. Let's see a picture of Petach Tikva, guys, 1878, years before the World Zionist Organization, but Jews are already active here today. And let's look at the picture of Petach Tikva today. That is just a joke, of course. This is New York City. Petach Tikva today looks like that. Not bad at all. That is 2018. So that is the great leaps that Israel took place even before the World Zionist Organization took place. I want to give you another example of what's happening here. So frum Jews are establishing this very first Jewish communities. And you see an image of what's going to be the future first kibbutz. It's called Kinneret. It was in the shore of the Sea of Galilee, which you also, of course, in Hebrew, Kinneret. And a wise person once told me, if you really want to understand what is the price that the first Jews pioneers had to endure here in Israel, that it's going to be the next image. Yeah, this is the image. You can see, of course, a picture of a graveyard. This is a graveyard of Kinneret, my friends. These are tombstones of young kids who died from malaria. In other words, the sacrifice that the first pioneers had to endure was unbearable, unimaginable. This wise person once told me, if you want to understand what people endure, go to their cemetery. And actually, in every ancient cemetery in Israel, you can see these small tombstones as a symbol of the great sadness that people had to take place here in Israel. Now, I showed you a picture of a young man just before, and this is, of course, no other than, well, you saw already the picture, David Ben Gurion. See, these first pioneers Jews that established the kibbutzim already in Israel after the time of the first communities were great people. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, this is more or less how he looks like from the age of 20. David Ben-Gurion came here in 1906. These are key years because in these years, the Jews that came and established the first communities in Israel were very, very different than the people who established Petah Tikva, for example. See, David Ben-Gurion was part of a kibbutz member. What you see over here, this is one of, if not the most important picture to understand the pioneers of Israel. The bunch of people you see that are hanging around this house are the members of the first kibbutz called Ganya. And what is a kibbutz? It's a socialist, equal community. There's no status. Jews that come from Europe are used to for hundreds of years that people have different backgrounds, and that's why they belong to different groups. These people that came from very different backgrounds, some came from Orthodox families, some came from very aristocrat families, they all came here for one goal only, coming as one, establishing one community, and understanding that everybody's equal. Because if they're not equal, there is no way they can be able to establish a new community, a new state, a new step here in Israel. So this is Dgania, also established at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Soon I'm going to show you a map of how it used to look like after all these kibbutzim were established. In the meantime, look how many things happen while Jews are forming the World Zionist Organization in Europe. What you see is an image of the lottery, believe it or not, the establishment of the first Hebrew city. This is, of course, the city of Tel Aviv. And you see the pioneers here, very famous picture. And this is how Rothschild Boulevard, you saw the bunch of people that are standing with the lottery. That was 1907. And look at Tel Aviv today. Same place, by the way. Again, great giant leaps that state of Israel, land of Israel took place. But these youngsters that came here, like David Ben-Gurion, they came with a very firm ideologist background. You see a picture of Gordon. He was a philosopher. He was a mentor of all of these youngsters, even though he himself was, as you can tell, a pretty old guy. He was the one who was the mentor for all these youngsters that left their families in Europe and established the kibbutzim here. And you see a very interesting picture of a very famous family. You're not going to recognize these young kids, but one of them, actually the one on the right, is Moshe Dayan. Why do I show you a picture of Moshe Dayan as a young guy? Because his father, which you can see on the left, was a member of Dgania. So Dgania, as you know, was a kibbutz, a very socialist, equal way of living. It didn't really, of course, fit for everybody. That is why what you see, they established what we call a moshav. Moshav is like semi-social. In other words, there are things that everybody's equal, but of course you have your own plot of land, and that is exactly what you see. It's not a kibbutz. It's midway between a suburb and a kibbutz. That is a moshav, what we call here in Israel. Nahala was the first one, and the father of Moshe Dayan was the one to establish that. We're going to move forward, and you can see really how it looked like, and that is very important to understand how pre-existent state of Israel looks like. This is the famous N. Look at that. It actually creates the image of the English letter of N. You can see the shore of Tel Aviv, a lot of kibbutzim, a lot of moshavot, and it goes down to the Valley of Israel towards the east, and then go up again through the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, all the way to what's going to be the future state of Lebanon. This is where the first pioneering kibbutzim, moshavot, were established. And what you see is that these are the only places that the local Ottoman rulers actually let people buy their own land. This all land was all swampy area. No wonder that the price was high, and a lot of people died from malaria. But remember this end, because when we're going to jump forward to the partition plan, you can see the influence of it. Another here, you can see it right over here. You can see the black lines is, of course, the famous N. In other words, these brave pioneers helped to to establish what's going to be the future Jewish state. So I move onward to how the British, when they ruled here, wanted a Jewish state to look like. And the situation from our perspective became even worse, because what you see over here is the notorious white paper. This is how we call it, because the white paper was basically restriction Jewish movement here in Israel. This is the third one that was published in 1939, guys. 1939, the British are ruling over here, and what they're doing is restricting Jewish movement to no more than 70,000 Jews to immigrate to Israel in the course of the next 5 years. No wonder we were very, very outraged by that. There's a famous story about this person. This is the one of the first chief rabbis of Israel. His name is Isaac Herzl. He took the white paper in the great synagogue of Jerusalem. He ripped it apart, and everybody, regardless of the background, were against this white paper. His son soon followed him. Not so soon, but followed him. This is his son, Chaim Herzog. He was the future president of Israel. Before that, he was the UN ambassador of Israel. So what he did when there was an anti-Semite resolution that was passed in the Security Council, that Zionism is racism. Guys, we're talking about not BDS 2010 or 2015. We're talking about 1975. You know what he did? Guess what? Like father, like son. He took the white paper and he just ripped it to shred. And his son, the current chairman of the Jewish Agency, he also tore a paper, which nobody remembered. But you can see how it goes down in the family of the Herzog, who contribute and still do to the Jewish people in Israel and all around. I move forward to what's going to be already the establishment of Israel. You can see an image of Moshe Sharet. Alongside him, the future first UN ambassador of Israel, which is Abba Evan, and he's shaking the hand of George S. Marshall, guys. Marshall Plan, Secretary of State. This man is half God in Europe after World War II. And what he told Moshe Sharet during the midst of the independence war here in Israel is that, very politely, the United States of America will not back this Jewish community here in the land of Israel. He came back to David Ben-Gurion. Remember him, the young pioneer, the bold one? He's sitting here in the top of the table, and he convinced one by one these members of this temporary cabinet to establish a Jewish state, and he convinced them to recognize, to declare a Jewish state, and this is exactly what you see over here. And as we move onwards, you can see how the ceasefire line looks like in 1949. You can see how it looks like near a city called Netanya, if you can see it. The width of Israel is only 9 miles. You know that Abba Evan, as I mentioned him before, he called it the borders of Auschwitz. So Israel, young Israel, was in a very, very grave situation, even though it was established, but still, the situation wasn't so great. Historical moments, you can see Abba Evan and Moshe Sharet, the first Secretary of State. Who would believe it? 4 years after the Holocaust, and they're waving the flag of Israel in Lake Success. We move onward to what is, you could say, the approach of Israel in the early years. A group of Jews from Yemen that came to Israel in the big aliyot, as we call them, the big immigrations to Israel. You need to understand this. Population of Israel, 1948, listen carefully, was only 600,000 Jews. That's it, all over Israel. Just to understand, Jerusalem is like twice the size today. And you can see another image of Jews coming from Iraq. My grandparents, from my father's side of the family, they also came to Israel from Iraq. And what you see over here is a temporary camp, I guess you could call it. We call it ma'abara. It's like a temporary place. And people were situated in these places for even 10 years, which brings to another great, amazing achievement of Israel. Even though Israel barely came out after the independence war, still the population tripled from 600,000 Jews, 1948, to almost 1.8 million Jews in a decade. That is, my friends, a miracle. That is what really enables the state of Israel to grow so fast, so rapidly. A great project was, of course, the national water carrier to provide people work. You can see how it took water all the way from the Sea of Galilee. People need to drink water. They're situated in the center of the country in Tel Aviv area. So the national water carrier was established, and we're talking about in the 1950s when the state of Israel was a tiny place. You move onwards, famous picture of 1967, the history is going to change forever, because now Israel is not such a small country. It's actually a regional power. And you can see in the middle, Moshe Dayan as Secretary of Defense, Yitzhak Rabin on the right, Chief of Staff. Famous images, very symbolic. You know, we commemorate here in Israel the eve of Holocaust Day. You can see the chief rabbi of the IDF back in the Six-Day War. And what you see over here is Chief Rabbi Goren blowing the shofar, something that the British didn't allow us until the establishment of the State of Israel. We couldn't really do it because there was no access to the wall. And you know what he's holding? If you're going to look closely, he's holding a Torah book. Believe it or not, this Torah book was actually survived from Auschwitz. So it's very symbolic. When you look at all these things, it brings a lot of emotions, a lot of thoughts of how we become from a country, from people that were just hunted because we're Jews, to a strong country in the Middle East. I'm fast forwarding to Yitzhak Shamir, almost done. Yitzhak Shamir, I mean, I can talk basically about everybody for an hour, you can imagine. Yitzhak Shamir, if there's one very important thing that he did, is actually continuing the tradition of bringing Jews to Israel. The last waves of, immigration to Israel were actually led by Yitzhak Shamir. So another big wave was, of course, the Jews from Ethiopia. And another one was, of course, the Jews from the former Soviet countries. You know, Yitzhak Shamir continued the bold tradition of David Ben-Gurion of doing what's right for Israel. And that is, of course, to bring Jews to Israel. He basically turned to the Secretary of State of the United States of America during that time, the late 80s. And he told them to not allow the Jews to America. In other words, he wanted the Jews to come over here. Now, of course, there's a lot of things you can say about it in the year 2020, but back then he saw it as the right thing to do. And over 1 million Jews, believe it or not, came from 1990 basically until now. That is a big, big number, which again enabled Israel to take giant leaps. Saying that, I want to conclude with somebody that we know, and regardless to our political opinion, you have to admit that politically this guy is really skilled, because Bibi Netanyahu, 1997, was the prime minister, and guess who's the prime minister in the year 2020? It still is the same Bibi. What I want to say by that, before I'm going to end, is of course that on the one hand side, Bibi is of course a representative of a new generation. The prime ministers before him were way older. We're talking about Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and of course Yitzhak Shamir. He was younger. He's actually the first prime minister who was born after the establishment of the State of Israel. He was living in America. He's very American in a lot of his approaches, and in his attitude and eloquency. And he's a representative of the new wave, the new generation of Israel, which on the one hand is very, very different than what it used to be. But at the same hand, hey, if he's still a prime minister, so I guess we're not that different as we used to do. And there's something very new, but very traditional with being a Jew. I'm going to wrap it up before I'm going to take questions. There was the former chief rabbi of England, Rabbi Lord Sachs. He used to say that Israel is the oldest country in the world, and it's the newest country in the world. I think that pretty much summons to what Israel represents. So this was my presentation. It was brief. There's a lot more to discuss about. And I would love to hear your comments, and of course, if you have any questions, I would like to take them.
So thank you very much, Eli, for this really incredible presentation about the establishment of Israel from the first Zionist assembly. If anyone have any questions, please share them now. And if not, I will ask you one question, or I'll actually start with an update to everyone. That just as we speak, there's news from Israel that we finally have an agreement for a new government.
Oh,
as we speak, yeah, you see, even a surprise for you. Yeah, so Benny Gantz and Bibi just signed the agreement to establish the new government. But I do want to ask you, and you showed a couple of cities that was established by the first settlers, and ask you why they chose these specific areas, this end that you showed. Why there? What was special about it?
okay. So that is a very good question. The truth is, it's not that something fascinating. There weren't any other choices. The ruling power over here, still at the end of the 19th century, is the Ottoman Empire. And the rules are very strict. It's not a democratic country. It's a power. It's a world power. And the only places that they enabled anybody to purchase land was a land that nobody else wanted to settle there. Petach Tikva, for example, that is just one of the examples I gave, was a very swampy area. And even though the first settlers came there in 1878, make no mistake, soon after, they didn't stay there. They either died from malaria and they moved back. But even more than that, the later settlers that came in the second Aliyah, David Ben Gurion, Levi Eshkol, amazing figures. Out of almost 40,000 people, listen to the number, 40,000 people that came to Israel to where? To an area of swamps, to an area of malaria, very dangerous place. The local population is not very cooperative with them. They don't know the mentality. They don't understand the language. Out of these 40,000, maybe, I'm exaggerating, but maybe 4,000 people actually stayed at the end. The rest of them either went back to Russia or went to America. In other words, what I'm saying is that the situation was highly challenging and very few people actually stayed, because that this famous N, the letter N, that we paid a very, very high price to hold it. And if you look at the Valley of Israel today, or the valleys around the Sea of Galilee today, it's remarkable. But that is, again, capturing, it's in a nutshell, what's the story of modern Zionism is all about, the modern Jewish state is all about. I think so.
Okay, we have another question from Peter.
Please.
Hi, this is Lauren, wife of Peter. I wanted to ask you about how the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim have been integrated with each other, and perhaps how they still need to be integrated.
Great question. So actually, I would highly recommend, if you could see the movie of Ephraim Kishon called Salach Shabbati.
I have seen it.
Many times.
Great. So that is just a really good example of the challenges of the early people that came here from our country. I'm going to tell you my own personal story, okay, which is very Israeli, I guess you could say. From my father's side, they all came from Kurdistan. Make no mistake, they came to Israel speaking only Arabic. The local population saw them as Arabs, not because, God forbid, they were racist. They were newcomers. They're not the people who established the kibbutzim, right? They were viewed as people that coming from very, very foreign mentality and culture. And that was not surprising at all. So the early years, were very, very challenging on the one hand. On the other hand, I have to say, I never heard my grandparents or a lot of other grandparents complaining about that because they understood that they are newcomers to a new country, to a new mentality, to a new state. I'm not even talking about the fact that they came to a democratic state. They came from other places in the world. It took a generation until you see more and more integration. My father already, being a Sabra, already born in Israel, going to the Israeli army, fluent in Hebrew, he married my mom. My mom came from Connecticut in the mid-1970s, and I'm the result. My wife, on the other hand, her mother came from Iraq, her parents came from Iraq, and my mother-in-law married a Jew from Hungary. So if you look already at the third generation, you see almost full integration, I have to say, with one inclusion. In the general population, that is what you're going to see. You're going to see very, very mixed families. With the more frum, the more Orthodox you are, the less integration you're going to see. And this is what you see actually in the frum communities. You see it with the Hasidic Jews. You see it with the Lithuanian Jews. Over there, you see how they're still keep it very, very separated from Sephardic Jews. But this is in numbers very small. Out of 6.5 million Jews in Israel, we're talking about a few 100,000 in total. So that's not the majority of Israel today, after 70 years of a state.
Thank you, Eli. We have another question from Louis.
Yes, hello. Okay. Yeah, you can hear me. I just want to say that this is a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. Toda rabah.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to ask you about the settlers, the differences between the German and the Austrian educated, quote unquote, Jews compared to the settlers that were from Poland and Russia, those kind of Jews. Did they have a problem? Now I understand why there were kibbutz, but what did each of them bring to the state of Israel? Because I think it was different.
You're absolutely right, and I'm going to emphasize something that I bet it was and somewhat not so clear. The more aristocrat, or I would say Western Europe Jews you are, the more you would emphasize the importance of the recognition of the powers during that time. And that is what Theodore Herzl did. From the moment that he established the World Zionist Congress, he met every head of state of a European power. He met the Sultan himself. He went to the Pope. He met representative of the French Empire. Make no mistake, he's able to do it because he's an educated Jew. He knows languages. He knows the world. He can approach them in a certain manner. You can see by his outfits how he understood the importance to receive recognitions from the powers that were controlling the world at that time. That's from the one hand. But on the other hand, you could meet as many as delegators as you want in the world. But if you're not going to have boots on the ground, so to speak, it's just not going to happen. When I showed you the famous N, it was the work of these pioneers coming from the poor Eastern European countries. Make no mistake. Of course that a lot of them came because the situation was bad. Anti-Semitism, poorness, people were seeking for a better fortune. On the one hand. On the other hand, same as Herzl, they were linked in a very traditional way to fulfillment of a Jewish dream of just establishment of a Jewish state because it's about time. David Ben-Gurion is a great example of that. Even though he came from a relatively more poor part of Europe, he was helping himself by just learning and getting himself education, even though he came from not such, you would say, a good background. It's not a good way to put it, but he had less, I would say, money in his family, I guess, just because that he came from not such a wealthy country, but it didn't change the fact that he really completed what Herzl ignited. See, if Herzl came up with the dream because he came from a big wealthy country, David Ben-Gurion came from a very, very practical manner of literally doing it. He was a member of a kibbutz himself, even though he wasn't such a great member of a kibbutz. He was just better in just being a, a leader and a very charismatic one of the Jewish Zionist movement.
Thank you very, very much, Eli. It was really wonderful presentation, and you can see the chat and all the people that really enjoyed it. And we'll go now to Deborah for our conclusion.
Thank you, Ellie. And thank you all for joining us. It was really spectacular. It's not too late to register for upcoming tour guide lectures. Our next lecture will be on Thursday, April 23rd at noon with Bus 5 tour guide Shaya Loev. His topic is Israeli World Traveler, 46 countries visited. In addition, on Friday, April 24th, don't miss the Global Connections virtual Kabbalat Shabbat with Israel at 10 a.m. You will receive an email soon with the information on how to register. And please, if you are able, please join me in making a gift to the 2020 UJA annual campaign. It is the fastest and safest way to make a difference now. Your gift will care for the most vulnerable in our greater Metro West community, locally and in Israel, and will literally save lives during times of crisis. Stay safe and healthy. We look forward to being together soon.